Hi, everybody. Welcome to the AMS 50 webinar series. And this is Jason Call, and a faculty member at the University of Minnesota, and also the editor-in-chief of Transport Research Part D, Transport Environment. And today we will have two speakers from Florida, and they will talk about the park and rec facility. And next, I will give the mic to my colleague, Ali.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ali Shamsherpur, a PhD candidate at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and I have the privilege of being here at this very moment as a co-moderator of our webinar today. So without any further ado, let me introduce Michael Lawrence to introduce the committee and talk a little bit about this webinar in general.
Great, thank you, Ali, and thank you, Jason, and both you guys for putting this together and organizing it. This seminar sponsored by the committee. Our committee is part of the Transportation Research Board. We're the Economic Development and Land Use Committee, and Jason and Ali and others have been organizing these webinars for a while now, and we have a few more scheduled coming up, and always looking for more topics that we can address. So if you have any ideas for us, please communicate them to us, and Jason can put them in the queue with others that he is looking at as well. We think it's a great opportunity for people to find information, and for those of you who are out there doing research and moving projects forward, it's an opportunity for you to present your research and get the information that you've collected and organized, get that information out to others around the country and around the world. So we're very indebted to Jason for putting this all together. Our committee is, as I said, part of the Transportation Research Board. We encourage people to coordinate with us and to be part of our committee. We have a very simple process where you can become a friend of the committee, and we'd love to have more and more friends in the US, all over the country and around the world. And if you look at the park and ride facility first slide there, you can see at the lower right-hand corner some instructions for how you can become a friend of the committee. So if you follow that process, you can become a friend of the committee, and we can give you some work to do to move forward our overall agenda. Our committee is focused on economic development and land use, and so we're kind of a mix of economists, planners, and other folks who are interested in those topics. And we encourage folks interested in those topics to partner with us and contribute to the committee in any way that they can. I want to also mention that as part of the seminar process, you can get AICP credits on a self-reporting basis for this seminar. So if you know how to do that, you can follow up with the AICP to get those credits. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Ali to get the seminar, the webinar on the road. Ali, pass back to you.
Thank you, Michael. So if we proceed to the next slide of our presentation, we have two major ways of raising questions for you. You can either type in the Q&A section of your Zoom app, and the moderator reads through your question for you, instead of that, you can just raise your hand virtually, and we will unmute you so you can tell us your question yourself. So let me also, before moving on to our first presentation, talk a little bit about our previous webinar. It was about the relationship between TODs and the urban development. We had two speakers, Dr. Yulin Chen and Dr. Joanna Ganning. And it was a wonderful talk. It is recorded, as we are also recording this webinar, and the record could be found on YouTube at this very link that you can see in this slide. So let me move on to our first presentation. We have Dr. Michael Duncan with us, who is an associate professor of urban and regional planning at Florida State University. His teaching and research generally focus on transportation planning. His specific interests relate to evaluating the viability of various strategies to mitigate the negative impacts of automobile dependence. He obtained his Ph.D. degree from the University of California at Berkeley. Dr. Duncan, please.
All right, does everybody see the slide okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, thank you everyone for being here and giving me the opportunity to present this research to you. So I'm going to be talking about the marginal impacts of park and ride facilities in the Twin Cities region. The research I'm going to present today has already been published in Transportation Research Records. So for those interested, I put the full citation at the bottom of the slide. And before proceeding, I want to acknowledge Jason Cow, who's the co-author of the paper that I'm presenting. To begin with, I want to first discuss the broader relevance of the marginal impacts of park and ride facilities. Transit operators commonly provide park and ride facilities to assure that those that don't live near transit stops can access the transit system. And this is particularly important in many US cities because most people don't live near a transit station. So they need this park and ride to have access to the transit system. But park and ride facilities do have costs associated with them, and these need to be carefully considered when deciding to build a park and ride facility. There are direct monetary costs to consider, such as construction and maintenance, and also the value of the land that the facility is built on. And in addition, there are non-monetary costs to consider. Since using a park and ride requires a car, one could argue that it promotes the pattern of auto dependence that we're often trying to avoid by providing public mass transportation. And along the same lines, a park and ride facility takes up prime land for TOD and also acts as a deterrent to pedestrian activity in the area surrounding the station. So this raises questions about whether building a station parking is really worth the cost. And I think that understanding the marginal benefits of these facilities can help us in our efforts to determine whether a park and ride facility should be built in a given location. The two specific research questions that we're trying to address with this study are, first of all, how park and ride users would choose to travel if they no longer had access to a park and ride facility. And answering this question tells us the net or the marginal impact of a park and ride facility on transit ridership. If park and ride users continue to use other forms of transit, then the number of riders directly generated by a park and ride facility would be a lot smaller than the actual number of people using the facility. And the second question we're addressing is how the alternative travel choices that are associated with park and ride removal would influence their vehicle miles traveled. So in other words, what is the net marginal impact of a park and ride facility on VMT? So to try and address these questions, we conducted a survey of park and ride users in the Twin Cities, Minnesota. And this survey was funded by the Minnesota Department of Transportation. And we relied on a web-based questionnaire, which generated 568 responses. And to talk a little more about how we recruited people to take the survey, we distributed flyers that had a link to the survey at 10 different park and ride lots in the Twin Cities. We surveyed a mix of commuter rail, light rail, and express bus stops. This is a relatively small sample of all the regional park and ride facilities, but given the time and resources we had available, we had to limit ourselves to just a few locations. In determining the locations to hand out the flyers, the specific stops where we were going to hand out flyers, we relied on the recommendations of a technical advisory committee that was put together by the Minnesota DOT. And the survey was done back in October and November of 2016. We had research assistants, and I think Jason did this himself too, go out between 6 and 9 a.m. on weekdays and hand out flyers to those that were entering the transit waiting area where they picked up the bus or the train. And then 2 weeks after the initial flyers were handed out, we went and put reminder flyers on the windshields of all the cars in a given park and ride facility. And I should also note that we gave out we gave out 10 $50 gift certificates as an incentive to complete the survey. We asked about a lot of different things on this survey, but there were two key questions that directly related to the research questions for this study. First of all, we asked them if a park and ride facility did not exist at the stop where they went on the train or bus, how would you have made the trip? And then, since some people responded to this by saying they would choose a different park and ride facility, we asked the following follow-up question. Assuming there wasn't a feasible park and ride option at another stop or station, how would you have made the trip? So out of the 568 total responses we got, we had 482 that gave complete responses to these two questions that were essential to addressing the research questions that I previously presented. So now I'm going to move into a discussion of the survey results. The chart that you should see on the screen now shows the percent of respondents that would make various travel choices in response to the removal of a park and ride facility. The bar on the left shows what they would do if only their original park and ride was unavailable. And in blue, you can see that most of them, roughly 60%, would choose an alternate park and ride facility. Another third, as shown in red, would choose to drive to their ultimate destination rather than use transit. And other choices such as kiss and ride, which is being dropped off at the station, or other forms of transit, or just canceling the trip altogether, make up the other 10% of the respondents. When we changed the scenario to having no park and ride available at all, which is what you see on the right, the number of people that would drive to their destination increases to about 3/4 of all respondents. And the number of people that would choose other forms of transit also doubled to about from 10% to about 20% of respondents. So in this chart, we're taking all the categories in the previous chart related to the use of transit and combining them. And you can see that if the original park and ride facility is unavailable, about 2/3 of the respondents would continue to use transit. But if all park and ride facilities are unavailable, this number drops to about 20%. Only 20% would continue to use transit in that situation. So the bottom line with these results here is that the marginal impact on ridership of any one particular park and ride facility is relatively small. But the marginal impact of the park and ride facility as a whole is going to be much larger. This chart shows the percent of a park and ride users that are directly generated by a park and ride facility by specific station. So I'll note that the orange indicates a commuter rail station, the green indicates a light rail station, and the blue is an express bus stop. The number of the percent of park and ride users that are directly generated by that facility ranges from as low as 20% to as high as 45%. It's also worth noting here that the small sample size of respondents at some of these stations results in a very large margin of error, and that's represented by the thin black bar on the chart. This chart now shows the daily marginal users at a given park and ride facility. And this is the percentage from the previous chart on the previous slide multiplied by the average number of cars parked in the park and ride facility. And so the total marginal users generated that we estimate to be generated by a park and ride facility ranges from as low as 30 per weekday up to as many as 350 per weekday. And then to control for the number of parking spaces in a given park and ride facility, we can also look at the marginal riders generated per parking space. And this is going to be a function of the number of riders that would continue to use transit without the facility and the utilization rate of the parking facility. In other words, whether the lot is usually empty or full. And so this number ranges from below 0.1 to up to 0.35. So in other words, it takes the resources associated with providing between 3 to 10 parking spaces to generate a net increase of 1 transit rider. So now we're going to look at the marginal impacts on vehicle miles traveled. In the first column, we have our actual mean vehicle miles traveled for a park and ride trip among our survey respondents. And the average round trip distance from home to the park and ride facility is 12.5 miles. Then we estimated the mean vehicle miles traveled that would occur if the original park and ride facility went away. In other words, the VMT that would be generated by making the various alternative choices that were presented earlier. And that average would be 23 vehicle miles traveled. If all the park and ride facilities became unavailable, that average would increase to 31 vehicle miles traveled. And then if we look at the difference between the actual and the hypothetical VMT estimates, we can estimate the marginal VMT reduction associated with the park and ride trip. And so we estimate that removing the respondent's current park and ride facility would lead to an additional 10 vehicle miles traveled per trip. So this means that the presence of any given park and ride facility generates on average a reduction of 10 VMT per trip. Removing all park and ride facilities in the region would lead to 19 additional vehicle miles traveled per trip. So again, the presence of the whole park and ride system generates an estimated reduction of 19 VMT per trip. We can also look at the marginal VMT reduction per trip for individual stations. And as you can see, this ranges from 5 to 15. We didn't find much in terms of patterns to the different marginal impacts by station, but one pattern that was noticeable was that the marginal VMT reduction was weaker for the stations that are closer to the CBD, and in this case that we're measuring proximity to the Minneapolis CBD. Most of the park and ride users in our survey are commuting downtown, so this pattern likely stems from the fact that driving to their final destination doesn't add as much to the length of the trip when the park and ride facility is close to downtown. We can also look at the aggregate VMT reduction by station by multiplying the per trip reduction by the number of vehicles parked there. And so we see a large range here of less than 2,000 per weekday up to nearly 12,000 per weekday. And as with ridership, the aggregate VMT reduction likely relates to the number of parking spaces in the facility. So to control for that, we can look at the VMT reduction per parking space. And this shows that on average, a parking space in a park and ride facility generates a reduction of between 4 and 16 vehicle miles traveled. So to quickly summarize the findings, the net ridership increase that's associated with a given park and ride facility ranges from 20% to 50% of the total current users. And this translates to 30 to 350 weekday riders, depending on the size of the facility. And then if we measure that in terms of parking spaces, this translates to 0.1 to 0.35 weekday riders per parking space. The net ridership increase associated with all park and ride facilities is just over 80% of total current users. And this translates to about 15,000 weekday riders when you apply that number to all the park and ride users in the Twin Cities. In terms of VMT, the net reduction associated with a given park and ride facility ranges between 5 to 16 vehicle miles traveled per trip, and I should say per round trip. And this translates to 2,000 to 12,000 aggregate weekday VMT at a given station that can be directly attributable to the park and ride facility. Or this also translates to 4 to 16 VMT per parking space. The net reduction associated with all park and ride facilities is about 19 vehicle miles traveled per park and ride trip. And when you apply that to all park and ride users in the Twin Cities, that gets us to about 350 VMT per weekday that are eliminated as a direct result of the park and ride system. The first most obvious takeaway from the study is that the raw usage number for a park and ride facility can be misleading. Transit use is not usually dependent on access to one particular park and ride facility, as our respondents often mentioned that they would use a different park and ride facility if their current one wasn't available. Further, some park and ride facilities generate minimal net benefits, and the continuation of these facilities deserves some more scrutiny. For example, the Anoka commuter rail station is estimated to directly generate only about 30 riders per weekday. And this raises the question of whether the resources that go into maintaining a 3-acre parking facility are justified by generating 30 additional riders. And despite the weak performance of some individual park and ride facilities, the park and ride system as a whole does seem to generate significant net benefits. And as I previously mentioned, more than 80% of our respondents said they would quit using transit without a park and ride option. But most of these riders, excuse me, could be maintained with a judicious reduction in the quantity or the size of the existing park and ride facilities. There are some important caveats to our work that would hopefully be improved with further research. First of all, this is a stated preference survey that asks about a very hypothetical scenario, and you can never quite be sure that the respondents are telling you, that what the respondents are telling you is what they would really do. The second caveat is that because we are not relying on a random sample, we can't be sure our selection of facilities is truly representative of the area's park and ride facilities. We think that they are, and our technical advisory committee gave us some good recommendations, but we obviously can't be sure about this. We also have a pretty small sample, particularly by station. And so having a bigger sample size, I think, would be helpful in more establishing some more concrete marginal ridership and marginal VMT reduction estimates. And the final point is there's an important question about the political viability of actually removing some park and ride facilities, even if that is what would be clearly the most efficient approach. Because these facilities have current users, and they also have people that probably champion the construction of the facility in a particular location, and these people would probably be highly resistant to their removal. Okay, and so that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. And I have my email up there if you want to email any questions that you don't get a chance to ask me today.
Thank you, Michael. It was a very good presentation and very interesting research. So we are open to questions for the audience if anyone has any questions for us. Yeah, we have a question here which says, is there a way to leverage this research study into future studies that emulate this methodology, but with the implications of COVID-19 also baked in?
Certainly that's possible, but it depends on how long COVID lasts, I guess. I'm not sure we could get funding and get a survey implemented if we get a vaccine out in short order, but but yeah, definitely. There are several places where I'd like to replicate this study. Obviously, this is just one region, and it would be good to replicate it in other parts of the, particularly other parts of the U.S.
Yeah, thank you very much. So any further questions from the audience? So I have a question myself. Oh, sorry.
Ali, I can ask you a question because Michael, you have done a lot of research regarding park and ride. So do you know to what extent that the park and ride facilitate the moving to the suburban neighborhoods?
Yeah, I'm sure that I don't have any concrete evidence for that. I mean, that I would guess that it does. The only evidence I've seen a paper that was based out of a study, a commuter rail facility in Israel. And that did show some pretty clear evidence that the park and ride facilities did lead to more suburbanization. But most of the research I've done doesn't look at those long-term impacts. And that's an important area of future research. But I haven't looked at that in particular, or I haven't seen much in that area either.
Okay, so we have another question also. Could you talk a bit about parking pricing at the destination, downtown specifically, as a factor in changing user behavior?
I guess, first of all, I don't think this is what you're asking, but just in case, I'll answer it. In the Twin Cities, I don't believe that they charge for parking at the park and ride facilities, but definitely at the destination. One of the biggest motivators in the survey for people using the park and ride lots in the first place is to avoid paying for parking. If I remember right, Jason, I think almost all of the survey respondents said they had to pay for parking downtown.
Yes, and actually, one of the respondents sent me a personal note saying, the light rail transit saved him more than $2,000 parking per year.
Okay. So thank you. Another question that we have here is park and ride usage in Twin Cities extremely down in 2020, down 95% from 2019. What do the researchers think the future holds for P&R facilities in the region? And what should planners do to balance monetary constraints and existing suburban transportation needs?
Yeah, I need time to think through that one. I didn't realize it was down that much. I guess it doesn't surprise me that much. I guess the real question there is how permanent is that drop?
Yeah, this downturn is really because the suburban service, because most people, as a white collar job in downtown area, and then most of them work at home. So that's the reason we see the down of this. But I think, for the park and ride facility, if the transit come back, I mean, the pandemic is over, I don't really worry too much about this because anyway, those people, they are the choice riders and also they commute to downtown to avoid parking and to avoid congestion. But what I'm really concerned is regarding the urban transit users, because many of them, because of the COVID situation, and they bought cars. So they become the car users, and then they may not come back to the transit. But for the suburban commuters, I think they will.
Great, thank you very much. We also have another question. It says, hi, Dr. Duncan. As sustainable driven transportation planners, how should we advocate for responsible P&R facilities? Because our natural inclination is to not advocate for them at all.
Yeah, I think you have to think carefully about the marginal impacts that I just discussed. And if you are intercepting people who would other drive long distances to downtown, and so you're reducing emissions that way, I think that you can advocate for a park and ride facility, but as I showed, not all park and ride facilities are doing that. And so those would be the kinds of park and ride facilities where maybe we should advocate for, particularly if it's a surface lot, maybe using some of that surface lot to build TOD.
Okay, great, thank you very much.
And John has a question. John, do you want to ask for yourself?
Yeah, sorry, I put it in the chat because I actually can't enter a question into the question and answer because I'm shown as a moderator. I was curious if you considered how TNC trips like Uber and Lyft could substitute park and ride, and if so, how much, or how would you go about studying that question?
Yeah, so in our survey, we had an other option in terms of what you would do if you didn't have access to a park and ride. And the people who responded other was so small that I didn't even include it in the chart. So I'm not sure whether that means that people just didn't accurately respond, or that's not a common occurrence here, or it's something that people just aren't considering. Jason, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, my sense is, park and riders, so they have the cars already. So this is a sunken cost. So that means, for them to drive from home to park and ride, the cost is not very high. And then when they have TNC trips, that's more expensive, right? Compared to the marginal cost of operating a car. So that's the reason I feel, the park and ride is still kind of viable if it is available compared to TNC trips.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense.
Yeah, may I add one more point? I fully agree with Professor Chow, but I think if it's microtransit, then things may happen, because microtransit is usually free, provided by the neighborhood, and then people may use microtransit to access and replace park and ride. But for Uber and Lyft, that's expensive. And for the people who are using transit, they usually want to save money. So I don't think TNC is really promising compared to microtransit.
But with that said, the Southwest Transit in Minnesota, they did provide a kind of Uber and Lyft, that kind of service, but that's provided by the transit agency. So it's more expensive than the general transit trips, but it's way cheaper than the TNC trips. So Ali, should we move on to the next presentation?
Yes, Dr. Cole, please.
Thank you, everybody.
Yep.
Okay, thank you, Michael. And so our next presenter is Dr. Peng Chen. And Peng is assistant professor in the School of Public Affairs at the University of South Florida. He specializes in shared mobility, personalized incentive for travel behavior change, and the relationship between travel behavior and health. His current projects are funded by the Center for Congestion Reduction and the Center for Transportation, Environment, and Community Health, both of which are funded by the US DOT. He published 25 peer-reviewed articles in the fields of transportation planning and road safety. And Chen served as editorial board member for Transportation Research Part D. He obtained his Ph.D. degree from University of Washington. Welcome.
Okay, so good morning. Today my topic is about how does park and ride perform, and I did an evaluation using longitudinal data from King County, Washington. And I also want to acknowledge the research assistant that did this paper with me about 2 years ago. So she is Xinwei Zhao. As Michael has already introduced, that park and ride is very popular in the United States. And I also want to give a short background. In the US, people have very high car dependency. And then this results in sometimes we have very limited parking space in downtown area. And that's why we somehow need to extend and also avoid the congestions in downtown area. That's why we have this kind of park and ride facilities in the suburban areas that helps to reduce congestion. So for park and ride, definitely has a lot of advantage. Somehow it extends the parking demand by allowing people to park in suburban areas, and also extend the catchment area that beyond a typical 10 minutes working. And also that help increasing ridership. And regarding the benefits that can help to reduce congestion, the empirical results from other papers suggest it's not quite significant, but it's minor contribution. But it also has a lot of disadvantage, as mentioned by Michael, and also from the existing papers. First, it discouraged transit-oriented development. And because transit-oriented development, we have a lot of commercial properties, residential areas, very mixed land use. Their property value are much higher than the park and ride. And also in terms of environment quality, the park and ride facility is very poor. So it's on the economical side, it has a lot of disadvantage. And also it makes walking and biking sometimes not that friendly. And also excluding people who cannot drive financially or physically. So also involves some equity issue. So from the environmental side, from the social side, also from the economic side, they all have some disadvantage. That's why we come to the conclusion we should be very carefully to think whether we want to build park and ride facilities, because it can be a failure considering the economical impact, the environmental impact, and the social impact. And that's why I think comprehensive evaluations are very needed regarding for the development of park and ride facilities in cities. So with the existing study, go through those research, and then I come to decide to evaluate the utilization rate of park and ride facilities, because this kind of study has rarely done. The existing study mostly use stated preference survey to do using cross-sectional data to do the evaluation. Longitudinal evaluation is very limited. And also, people rarely go back to evaluate the joint effect of both transit development plan and the park and ride facility promotion strategies. So that's, I think, the contribution that we have made in this research paper. So we focus on utilization rate and do an longitudinal evaluation. So in this paper, we ask two research questions. The first question is how well park and ride system perform over years. And well, because the local authorities has done a lot of transit plan or park and ride promotion strategies to improve the efficiency of the park and ride system, we want to evaluate what kind of policy tools they really make sense and help promote the park and ride system. So therefore, to address these two research questions, we set up a research framework, and we use the park and ride utilization rate as the dependent variable. And then we incorporate various explanatory factors, including the policy tools, land use, road facilities, transit ridership, and the level of transit services, the social demographic factors in the neighboring neighborhood, and also the gas price and the weather conditions. I think weather conditions, especially to Seattle area, because it's rainy city, and when there are many rains, and people may not really want to use use the transit. So I also look back to the existing literature. I split into two parts, actually three parts. The first part is about the demand for park and ride facility. I think this is maybe unique to San Francisco and Seattle, where transit is more popular. And like Portland, I think will be the same. New York will be the same. That the utilization rate of park and ride facility is fairly high. in San Francisco, the reported number from the other studies is about 90%. And in Personal Region Council, that's the other area, is about 80%. And so because of the high utilization rate, people are competing for park and ride facilities in the morning. So that's somehow also added pains to people who are really need park and ride facility. And that's why in this area, sometimes people charge a little money for park and ride facility. It's not free. It's somehow the local authority has to push people to avoid the illegal occupation of those park and ride facilities. In terms of the park and ride effects on travel behavior, for sure, it attracts more people to use park and ride facility, especially for those people living in the suburban neighborhoods. And it also helped to refine the catchment area of the retail centers, houses, and jobs, and help people to access the downtown area. That's the positive effect of the park and ride facilities. So in the existing literature, people examine the various factors. On the policy side, the parking supply in those park and ride facilities, and also the parking fees. Some city charge, and like I think in Minnesota is free, but in Seattle, San Francisco, Portland, I know they charge a little money, like $1 or $2 per day. And for the social demographic factors, gender, income, education level in the neighborhood definitely has some relation with the park and ride facility usage. And also that relates to how well the transit is served in that neighborhood. That relates to the quality of transit services, the frequency of transit services, and how secure for people to in the park and ride area. And also the physical attributes like the capacity of parking, the fare, and also the attributes of the service facility. Therefore, we included a lot of factors into consideration. And these factors, especially road design, ridership, policy tools, land use, and gasoline price and weather conditions did not receive much attention in the previous literature. And our data is a longitudinal data, and that somehow provide another approach compared to the widely used stated preference survey. So that's the what we learned from the literature. And this figure, I think, is the most important figure in our research, in our paper. We synthesized all kinds of actions have been done by the local agencies, including transit development and also the policy and the plans related to park and ride. So before 2008, the King County, they have done a lot of effort to expand the park and ride lots in the suburban neighborhoods. And that's mostly low density area because there is a need there. But at the year of 2008, there was the economic recession. That was because about half of the money is coming from the sales tax, and because the economic downturn, and then the local agency just does not have the money to support transit development, and then that results in a lot of cut. And then as a mitigation, the local agency increased the transit fare by 4 times, and that result in the finally accumulatively increased the fare by 80%. And in the year of 2009, the King County area, they start to use the OR card. It's one regional card for all. They implement this card that somehow help people, especially if you ask people to pay like $1.25, usually people may not have the $1.25, and that has somehow helped facilitate riders, but it's not a big advancement. And also by the year of 2010, the local agencies start to provide this kind of rapid ride. It means that they sometimes those transit can skip many stops that somehow improve the efficiency of transit for those long distance riders. And also they in 2011 to 2021, the local agency tried to improve the non-motorized mode access to park and ride facilities. And also in later Seattle, because in the year of 2014, another round of economic downturn that has impact on the budget for transit. But somehow at that time, because of congestion pricing in that area, that also gives some money back to the transit development, somehow mitigates the shortage of funding. And then in 2012, also King County promote alternative transportation mode, such as carpool, vanpool, microtransit, these kind of things that help promote the usage of transit as well. That also relates to the park and ride facility usage. And then start to considering the battery equipped tolerant buses. And one important action later is in 2015, the local agencies start to be very considerate to those low income people. They can use the reduced fare, participate in the reduced fare program as long as they can prove their income is much lower than the average. Like other people may pay $2.75 per one trip, and they just need to pay $1 per one trip. And in the year of 2016, that's a big movement, because in Seattle area, there are multiple agencies that are operating transit, including King County Metro and such as Sound Transit. And they are different companies, and then they charge people for different prices. But because of integration, also because of the ARC card, now people just may pay one trip, and then if they transferring from one company to another company, as long as it's within 2 hours, the transfer is free. That greatly reduced the cost for transit. That also helps to increase the ridership. So that's all the actions have been done in King County during the I think that across almost 2 decades. So that's a lot of actions, and we somehow take them as policy tools and considered into our research. Now I'm presenting the data that we used. It's from 2004 to 2017, and this data is monitored by the state of Washington, DOT. So the original data, including the lot number, the park and ride name, the space available in that park and ride lot, and also the space used each day. So in total, we have 135 park and ride lots in King County, and the parking spots is almost 20,000. And we aggregate the utilization rate per day, and that's ranging from 5% to 142. 142 indicates that the high turnover rate at some park and ride lots, and on average is about 60% over the 14 years. So this is the box plot that we printed out for the 14 years. On average is about 60%, compared to the previous study, which reported about 80%. I think that's maybe just in Seattle area and in certain years, not because in the early years, the numbers are smaller. And if you go back to this figure, what we can see here in the most suburban areas, that's where those no numbers are located, and the usage rate are fairly low in these areas. If you are familiar with Seattle area, this is Seattle, Bellevue, Merced Island, Tacoma, Kirkland. And you see in Seattle and Bellevue in general, the usage rate is much higher. Okay, so that's the descriptive data analysis we have done. In the end, we include, because you see we have more than 10 policy interventions happened during the 2 decades, but actually many of them happened within, approximate years, because we use dummy variable to account for such policy intervention. And in the end, we only include 3 policy tools. The first one is economic crisis, occurred in 2008. And then congestion pricing, multimodal transportation, fare reduction, that's in 2015. And then transit integration in 2016. And for land use, we consider the percentage of various land use at the park and ride facility areas, including residential, commercial, public land, and the green space. And we also calculated the land use mix. And for road infrastructure, we consider road density, intersection density, the number of bus stops and the transit stations, and also the percentage of bus routes and drive lanes in that area. And we also calculate the ridership within 1/4 mile. We consider socioeconomic factors, especially such as age, gender, race, education, also considering gas and the weather. We did 2 models. One is quantified the neighboring building environment at 1 mile level. Another one is at 3 miles level to test the consistency of our modeling outcome. I will skip this method. We use the panel Tobian model because this is longitudinal data. And we use Tobian model is because the utilization rate is for sure greater than 0. So it's sensor data. And we did it in R. So now I'm presenting modeling outcome. As you can see from here, basically the 2 models are very consistent, and therefore we just use the 1 mile buffer for the final interpretation. And I will skip this table, and now we can look at the results. For the results, the 3 policy tools, the 2008 economic crisis, the congestion pricing, as well as the multimodal transportation provision, and also the bus rail integration, they all suggest positive effects on the park and ride utilization rate. And there are many factors in the building environment, including land use mixture, road density, employment density, people aged from 18 to 34, the percentage of elderly people, the percentage of white people, and also the percentage of poverty, bus ridership. Although this one has an endogeneity with the park and ride utilization rate, we tested and finally we decided to include for implication. They are all positively related to park and ride utilization rate. And the other factors have some negative effects, including the percentage of drive lanes, the percentage miles, and the commuting by driving. We also think this one has an endogenous issue, but still included. So the major finding that we learned from this study, the first one is park and ride facilities help increase transit ridership, especially in those areas with the young adults, senior citizens, and the low-income people. So from the social side, it brings a lot of benefits to the vulnerable group. And also for building for the urban form, high density and the mixed land use area, they really have higher utilization rate of park and ride facility. So it promotes usage efficiency. And the integration of the different companies integrating the rail and buses promotes the utilization of the park and ride facility. And the other 3 are related to the policy tools we have discussed. The first one is especially during and after the economic crisis, transit must be saved because they are positively correlated with the park and ride facilities. It makes sense because especially after economic crisis, many people may not be able to afford a car, and the transit is the best option for them. Can satisfy their mobility needs, and the congestion pricing as well as the multimodal transportation development, they also have an effect on promoting park and ride facility. And for transit development, park and ride facility promotion strategies, land use plan, and other travel demand management strategies, and we encourage to be jointly considered given they are interrelated. So there are some limitations in this study as well. The first one is the transit ridership data was treated as cross-sectional despite the transit ridership has been increased in Seattle for a long time. The reason is that the method that the local authority to collect transit ridership data has been changed over years. And before 2009, people just estimate the transit ridership, but after 2009, they have the card And then is the estimation and the way of documenting the data has been changed. And actually before 2009, we were not able to obtain the data. And the second part is we involve different analytical units, including census block groups and the traffic analysis zones. We did some spatial weight strategies to handle those data, but this may involve the ecological foci. And also, I think Seattle may be similar to Portland and San Francisco in the West Coast. Transit somehow much more popular comparing to other US cities. So the implications can be constrained in this area. So that's the three limitations that we have identified from our study. And for future research, there are some uncertainties we observe because the population grows and also limited land in Seattle and also the funding constraints. To put them together is somehow hard to estimate the future, but what is promising is that park and ride facilities will be popular in this area. And the second interesting point we are thinking is about the introduction of autonomous vehicle into the future, and then that can somehow greatly reduce the park and ride trips. I mean, from home to, I mean, that can be people just, the autonomous vehicle may just pick up their passengers and then leave them at the bus station. And then park and ride facilities, the demand can be greatly reduced. And maybe people just directly drive people from their home to their destination using autonomous vehicle. So things may change in the long run, and we don't know yet. And this type of study needs to be simulated. So I also have some quick thoughts for park and ride long-term development. The first one is thinking about the performance-based charging stream for the park and ride facilities. This may somehow reduce the competition, especially in the morning time, and that somehow can relieve the pressure for many residents. Who come earlier, they can get it free, and who come later, who pays more. And also, I'm thinking about integrating the good features of the park and ride facility or other affordable housing programs. This can somehow, reduce the monetary cost for park and ride facilities. The third thing I'm thinking about is to estimating the impact of on-demand mobility services, such as microtransit. As we discussed before, I think for TNC, it has some weakness, but microtransit, I think, has a lot of privilege on this point. The last part is to simulate the impact of shared autonomous vehicles on both transit planning and also park and ride facility usage. So that's all I have for today's presentation. So thank you. This paper has been published in Transport Policy about 1 year ago. So if you cannot get this paper, you can send me an email and I can share with you. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Peng. And I think this is a very interesting presentation. And so audience, if you have any questions, so please type in the Q&A session. And also in the meantime, I will have one clarification question for you, Peng. And I think you mentioned you use about half a mile as a buffer, is that right?
I mean, for the quantified built environment, I use 1 mile and 3 miles. But for the transit ridership, we just use 1/4 mile for the bus stations or bus stops located near the park and ride facility to get the ridership data.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
And so why did you use 1 mile and 3 mile?
1 mile is the working distance, and 3 mile is people can drive within 10 minutes to get to the park and ride facility. Then because they still, after they get there, they need to find a parking spot, and then they can get to wait the bus. And so typically we estimate if beyond 15 minutes, people may just directly drive to their destination, considering because each people has like 45 minutes, they will feel more comfortable for a commuting trip beyond that, people may feel uncomfortable. So we think 15 minutes is a more reasonable distance considering the whole process of using the park and ride facility.
Okay, thank you. And I think this may vary by region. And if I remember right, from Duncan's paper, I think the average round trip for the park and ride in the Twin Cities is about 12 miles. So that means one way is about 6 miles.
6 miles, yeah. So I mean, and also at that point, because one reviewer, he suggested us to compare the variation for different distance, and we used the 3 mile as a kind of cross validation to check the consistency and whether things change as we increase the distance. And we don't see much change, but we lose some variables because of the when we aggregating for a larger that relates to the regression towards the mean and the multicollinearity issues. And so finally, we choose to present the 1 mile buffer model.
Okay, so Peng, you can also check the Q&A session. You will see there's one question there, and then I will read the question while you are thinking about how to answer this question, okay? So
Okay.
park and ride would seem to be competitive with local bus service, on-call shuttles, and ride share, formerly taxi, use as access to mainline transit services. In low-density areas, could park and ride be more cost-effective at gathering riders for more effective transit than more traditional transit service? It would seem that park and ride lots need to be at the bus and rail stop, not a walkaway.
So this is a very long question. Please let me respond one point to one by one. The first one, yes, I agree that that's why I include the quality and also the frequency of bus services in our model, because we want to account for that. If the frequency is low, and then the park and ride utilization rate will be low. And for on-call shuttles and ride share, I think I will use Professor Chao's answer to this question. To me, if people has to pay more than $5, but they just for ride share, but they just pay for $2 to ride a transit, and they will consider if they just drive directly to their destination, if they don't cost that much and they can save some time, they will not considering about the environmental impact, things like that. They will just direct drive to their destination. So for most people who want to save money to use transit, I don't think ride share is a reasonable option. But on-call shuttles, like I said, is like micro transit. If it is free, and then I think people will like to use it. But in that case, then people don't need the park and ride facilities anymore for those people who can use on-call shuttle. In low density area, could park and ride be most cost effective to get the riders for more effective transit than more traditional transit services? For low density area, I think that's I think for Seattle's case, actually Seattle is very conscious in choosing the park and ride site, because they don't want to lose the economic benefits. As we said, if that's why I think people choose did place this park and ride facility in low density areas. In high density areas, park and ride is not cost effective because people lose a lot of money. If you change them to TOD and change to the other commercial facility, affordable, the other housing programs, they can collect more tax revenue for the county. So I think that's why low density area park and ride is more cost effective. So park and ride nodes needs to be at the bus or rail stop, not a walkway. Yes, so they must be typically at the large bus stations, not a bus stop.
Okay, thank you, Peng. And given the time limits, I will just ask the last question, and then I will bring Michael back to the conversation. And then from the start screen, you can see, Peng has already offered some sense regarding the future research on park and ride facility. And Michael, do you have any suggestions for future research?
Sure, and I actually had a slide that I skipped in the name of time. but
okay, I can let you share. I can stop my.
Well, I don't need to share it. I can
Okay.
just I can just bring it up so I have my list. Give me one moment. All right, yeah, so future research. I think it's important to estimate the opportunity costs of park and ride facilities. So for example, my research is showing like the marginal ridership generated by a park and ride facility. And I think it would be a useful next step to take that marginal ridership and divide that by the cost of providing that park and ride facility to get the cost per rider estimate, and then look at cost per rider estimates for other types of interventions. And for example, expanding service, increasing frequencies, building shelters at bus stops, and see if maybe that might be a better investment of these funds rather than building these underutilized park and ride facilities. So that would be one, and maybe there are plenty of park and ride facilities that make the grade, that actually have a good ratio of riders per dollar. But I'm certain that some of them don't, and I think it would be good to kind of lay that out clearly. And another important thing I think to do with our research project would be to look at other cities, for example, like the Bay Area and Washington, D.C., where the park and ride lots are heavily utilized, but also where the rail systems there are essential to the transportation system. So my guess is the marginal impacts are pretty limited, because a lot of people would figure out a way to get to the BART station or the DC Metro station, even if there wasn't a park and ride lot. And so the marginal impacts might be much weaker in places like that. But obviously the research needs to be done to show that.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. And it's already 8 minutes past the hour. And so I think, today's webinar, we're going to stop here. But, before we leave, and then I want to make another announcement. In February, we will have another webinar, but this one is a TRB-wide webinar that's regarding the transit-oriented development and about the history, right? So the past, present, and prospective. And the exact time has year to be determined. And so please, check our email communication and also our social media. So in that case, you can know the exact location at the time and location, and also the speakers are from Europe. Thank you, everybody. I will see you next time. Thank you, Mike and Peng.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.